The old mansion at the top of the hill had been a source of curiosity for the townspeople. It's said to have been owned by a wealthy gentleman who kept to himself and rarely ventured out of the house into the world. Rumors circulated that strange artifacts adorned the walls of the mansion's many rooms. An eerie atmosphere seemed to exude from the place. Few had ever seen the owner of the mansion, and those who did described him as a gaunt figure with sunken eyes and a thin, almost skeletal frame. He was rumored to be obsessed with esoteric books, particularly the infamous Necronomicon, a tome said to contain knowledge of the darkness and the most forbidden kind. Despite his fascination with these forbidden texts, the gentleman never dared to read them, knowing full well the maddening effects they could have on the mind. Instead, he collected them, storing them in a vast library that took up an entire wing of his mansion. The townspeople whispered the old gentleman's obsession had driven him to madness, that he had become a recluse in his own home, surrounded by the cursed tomes that he so coveted. This was only partially true. His obsession was his madness. His endless pursuit of the esoteric knowledge consumed his every thought and action. Some said that he had even made a pact with the devil, trading his soul for the knowledge contained within the books. This was also fabricated. His interests never lied with Catholicism. Satan, like many other dark deities, he marked as legends, and that alone. The old ones, on the other hand, he had first knowledge of their existence. Regardless of what the townspeople thought, the truth is far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. For as the gentleman grew older, his obsession grew with him. The Necronomicon, the Book of Ibon, the Book of Dizan, the Order of the Moth, the Cultus des Gules, and the Mysteries of the Worm. Each of these books is said to contain a dangerous forbidden knowledge, and those who seek them out do so at great risk to their own sanity and safety. Henry had no plans to risk his own mental well-being. His chauffeur alerted him to their arrival at the Melrose Asylum for the criminally insane. A smile stretched across his face from ear to ear. His thoughts danced with the possibilities, his pace quickening as he walked up the winding path. Big steel barred gates opened as he approached. A guard signaled for Henry to follow. With the dismissive hand gesture, he relieved his driver. Curiosity overwhelmed him at the sight of the mentally impaired patients pacing around the grounds. The warden of the facility was at the door to meet Henry. "Ah, our biggest donor finally makes our acquaintance. We've wanted to put a face to the check. Your contributions have already started the West Wing's construction. Right this way, sir." The warden led him up to the top of the long staircase to his office. Henry stood at the front of the warden's desk, his eyes fixed on the man's face. He could see the greed and corruption in the warden's eyes, and he knew he had found a kindred spirit. "I'm willing to pay you a substantial amount of money for your cooperation," Henry said, his voice low and persuasive. The warden leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "I'm listening," he replied, a sly grin spreading across his face. "I need access to your most unstable patients, those whose minds are already teetering on the brink of insanity," Henry explained. "And what do you plan to do with them?" the warden asked, his eyes glittering with anticipation. "I have a collection of books that contain knowledge men should not know, and no mind can comprehend. And in order to read them, I must have one with a certain disposition, a certain weakness. That's where your patients come in," Henry said, a hint of excitement creeping into his voice. The warden's eyes widened with greed. "And what do I get out of this?" he asked. "I'll pay you handsomely for each patient you provide, and I will make sure that no one ever finds out about our arrangement," Henry replied, his voice dripping with promise. The warden considered for a moment before nodding his head. "Very well. I'll give you access to the patients you need, but remember, this never happened, and if anyone ever finds out, it'll be your head on the chopping block," he warned. Henry smiled thinly. "Don't worry, Warden. We'll both benefit from this arrangement, and the knowledge we gain for all of this will be worth the risk," he said as the warden rose from his chair and led him down the dimly lit hallways towards the patients' rooms. He read their files and picked his candidates. Madmen screamed and threw shit and moldy food at the guards. Henry shot a wicked glance towards one inmate, and he pissed himself, petrified as the withered expression looked at him. Arriving back at his manor, Henry sat in his study surrounded by stacks of ancient tomes and forbidden text, most of which believed to be burned during the Inquisition. He had spent years collecting these books, seeking out the most powerful and dangerous spells and incantations from people who had lost their minds translating them. The shipment of criminally insane inmates he had purchased from the asylum was due to arrive in just a few hours. He had been preparing this moment for months. He had carefully selected the books that he would need the inmates to read, choosing ones that were so full of dark magic and ancient wisdom that they could drive any mind into madness. He had already begun to prepare the ritual space, drawing intricate symbols on the floor in chalk and setting up candles and incense in the corners of the room. He had even gone so far as to make offerings to the ancient gods he hoped to summon, sacrificing small animals at the edge of his property. As the inmates arrived, Henry's excitement grew. He knew that he was on the verge of unlocking a power that few men have ever known. He relished in the thought of being in the middle of the chaos and destruction as it was unleashed onto the world. As the transport put its brakes on, he could hear the hiss of the hydraulics through his window. Henry waited eagerly in his study, watching as the delivery truck escorted the sacrifices onto the estate. He greeted the guards who had accompanied the inmates, instructing them to leave their prisoners in the ritual space he had prepared. As they led the inmates into the room, they could feel the fear and confusion. He paid them no mind. They left, and he provided a sedative cocktail of sodium pentothal and a couple other things that would ensure their malleability. There were nothing more than tools to him, expendable pawns for his quest to ultimate power, but he treated them as pilgrims to the new beginning, an alternate outlook on life unseen in their days in the asylum. He instructed the inmates to sit in a circle around him. They began to read from the ancient tomes and selected rituals. The words are translated by men who had gone insane decades ago, but as they spoke, they could feel the power building within them. The inmates began to stir, their eyes widening, listening to the words as they spoke. Henry started to read, his voice growing louder and more frenzied with each passing moment. As the ritual reached its climax, a bright light filled the room, blinding Henry and the inmates. When the light faded, Henry knew he had succeeded. He had summoned the ancient god, the one that would grant him power he had always craved, Tsathoggua, god of primordial space. But as he turned and faced the inmates, he realized too late that something had gone wrong. Horribly wrong. The power he had summoned was not under his control, and it had no intent of being used for his purposes. With a ferocious roar, the ancient god unleashed his wrath upon the inmates, tearing them apart with a force no human can see with its naked eye. Henry watched in horror as the ritual space was consumed by chaos and destruction. His revelations came too late, for this fatal mistake was his doom. He ran for the exit, slamming the door shut with the Elder Seal on the other side, preventing Tsathoggua from ever leaving that ritual space. With his back against the door, he slid down it. In a state of rage, confusion, and depression, he went over the whole thing, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. He assumed the inmates were illiterate and decided he had to take a different approach. A gargantuan roar filled the atmosphere of the house, shaking the foundations. The sounds of whispering souls cascaded into the background. His old leathery hand was trembling. He had been in a pursuit of power, and had greatly underestimated how powerful of a being he was summoning. Pushing the fear back in his mind and replacing it with determination, he picked himself up and went back to his study. Trying to figure out a better way, he needed someone that could translate this ancient text. And manipulation was his first trick, one he had perfected over the decades. Henry was born into a wealthy family and had always had a fascination with the occult and dark arts. As a child, he had been exposed to ancient texts and artifacts by his father, who was a collector of rare books and antiquities. But it wasn't until Henry inherited his father's vast fortune his obsession with esoterics truly took hold. He used his vast resources to scour the world for these texts. As he delved deeper into these books, Henry began to realize it contained knowledge and secrets that were beyond the comprehension of ordinary mortals. He became obsessed with unlocking these mysteries, spending countless hours poring over the books and studying ancient languages. None of them he was able to fully master, but Henry's obsession grew. So did the darkness within him. The more he delved into this path, the more he was consumed by their power. He began to experience vivid nightmares and hallucinations. Driven by an insatiable thirst for knowledge, he surrounded himself with like-minded individuals, forming a secret society dedicated to the study of the occult arts. As he acquired these texts, he no longer sought to be around human beings anymore. He believed they held a secret power and mastery over forces of darkness. He outlived or outright killed the members of his secret order. So now he began a search for someone to do his bidding. Weeks went by, hours spent making inquiries, while he did his best to ignore the horrifying whispers from the room behind him. Beyond its locked doors, an ancient god beckoned.
You dare summon me and trap me in this tomb?
He had contacted universities and academic institutions, but none of the scholars spoke to him or were willing to take the job. They were either too busy with their own research or not interested in working with someone as notorious as Henry was. But nonetheless, he was never deterred. He knew that if he wanted to achieve his goals, he needed to find someone that would eventually hear him out. He found a young linguistics scholar by the name of Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had just completed her doctoral thesis on ancient languages and was looking for work. Henry knew he had to finesse her. She was a strong-minded individual. This he respected. But he couldn't just come out and tell her the truth about what he wanted her to do. He needed to subtly persuade her. He arranged a meeting with Dr. Rodriguez at his mansion. She was hesitant, but when she arrived, he greeted her warmly and showed her around his estate and his extensive library. She remarked at some of the rare titles in his collection. Henry noticed her attention to some of them. "I have a job for you, and if you complete it for me, I will grant you 10 books you choose from my library, no matter which one." At this, her eyes grew in excitement, but she lowered her brows in suspicion. Then he took her to his private study, where he revealed his ancient texts. "These are invaluable," he said, "but unfortunately, they were written in languages that I cannot read. That's where you come in, Dr. Rodriguez. I need someone with your expertise to help me translate them." Intrigued by the challenge, she asked, "What are these texts?" Henry handed her one of the ancient tomes, bound in leather and covered in dust. She began to examine it, her eyes lighting up with excitement, with a hint of horror realizing its contents. "This is sacrilegious, abominable. Why would you want to know such things? I must warn you, these books contain esoteric knowledge unknown to man. Many people have fell victim to the words in those pages. I implore you to read with caution, but the knowledge contained in those books are paramount to my research. Along with your pick of 10 books from my library, I will write you a check with as many zeros as you wish if you only translate the text for me." She looked down at the decrepit leather. "I can translate this," she said, "but it will take time and a lot of effort." Henry smiled inwardly. He also offered her a room on his estate to conduct her translations, allowing her access to his vast resources and promising to support her work in any way that he could. Dr. Rodriguez agreed to the job, excited by the challenge and opportunity to work with such a vast collection of ancient works, and the promise of adding something extremely valuable to her own collection. Henry felt a sense of satisfaction as he watched Dr. Rodriguez leave his mansion. He knew that he had successfully finessed the only one on this planet worthy of doing his bidding. He couldn't wait to see what dark secrets and ancient knowledge lay hidden in those books of his, and what he could achieve with his newfound power. When his mansion was being built, he had engineers install stone cylinders in the center of his property. This acted as his ritual room, and sealed in the inside was an ancient god. He called upon his construction team he had under contract and paid handsomely, mostly for their discrepancy. With heavy equipment, they removed the cylinder from the center of the House of the Crane, placing it in a silo graveyard of previous attempts and failures to similar rites he performed, replacing it with a brand new one, a replica of the first, down to the engraven elder seals on the outside walls. Dr. Rodriguez returned a few days later equipped with reference books and enough clothes to last a month. She was escorted to her sleeping quarters and ushered into the kitchen afterwards for dinner, which was an extravagant affair to say the least. Even though it was just him and her present, there was enough food to feed a small platoon of soldiers. A faint boom of thunder entered the room from the windows, signifying the oncoming storm. Henry knew this weather was perfect for these kind of rites. "If you're not too tired from your trip, I wish to begin tonight," Henry said expectantly. She gave no words, just a nod of agreement, and continued to eat in silence. Something lingered in her thoughts she wasn't telling Henry. Since that test read, she had horrible nightmares plaguing her every night. She tried to tell herself rational explanations of these things, but she was convinced the uncanny strangeness of it all had unmistakably been from the taste of that book. Despite her reservations, the doctor was able to make progress with the translations after all, deciphering the complex symbols and piecing together the meaning of the texts. Each passing day she grew empty, as if the very act of translating these esoteric pages had slowly drained her of her spirit. On one ominous evening, they had finished their meal and Dr. Rodriguez stumbled across a particularly troubling section of the book. The symbols were unlike that of any of the other chapters, and she struggled to make sense of it. The words accompanied with graphic imagery, some of it representing the preparation of necessary sacrifices. Her blood ran cold when she connected the words. A terrible realization struck her at the people that had tried this before her. As she read the words aloud, a strange energy filled the room. The air grew cold and faint. Otherworldly glow emanated from the pages of the book. Suddenly, she couldn't stop. She made a terrible mistake. She accidentally spoke the beginning of the spell, and the words took hold of her. The creature appeared before them in a burst of black smoke, towering over them like a monster from some nightmare. Its eyes glowed sickly red. Its skin was covered in writhing tentacles that seemed to move on their own accord. In its massive form, gaping eyeballs would open and start staring at Henry and Dr. Rodriguez. Henry was frozen with fear, unable to speak. His hands trembling, he reached for the book and began reciting an incantation in reverse. The creature let out a piercing scream and the air began to ripple and distort around them. Dr. Rodriguez collapsed into the floor, gasping for breath. Henry rushed to her side, his face pale with terror. "What have you done?" he whispered. The doctor looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to. But it's too late. The damage is done." Her eyes rolled in the back of her head as she spoke her last words. Henry melted to his knees in an involuntary obedience.
You foolish mortals have unleashed a power you cannot comprehend. I am the harbinger of doom, and my arrival signals the beginning of the end of your world. You will pay the ultimate price for your curiosity. I have been waiting eons to return to this world, and now that I am here, I will not be stopped again. Your feeble attempts at banishing me only made me stronger. You think you can defeat me? You think you can comprehend the power I wield? Your mind would crumble before the sight of me. If I assume my true form, the very sight itself will consume your flesh. Your screams are music to my soul, and I revel in your agony. Your fate is sealed. You are my puppet now. I will pull your strings how I see fit, to the very end of your pitiful existence. I am the end of all things, the void that devours all light and suffocates all hope. You are insects before me, and your futile struggles amuse me.
A loud metallic ring, the last sound Henry heard. His pathetic mind evaporated in the ooze. In front of the ancient demon he collapsed. He gained the knowledge he sought, but in the end his mind just couldn't handle it.